Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for joining us today for our event. I'm very excited. Oh, I see the dogs behind you, Dan.
Sorry.
I'm very excited for the dogs, obviously. I'm very excited to be here today with Jonathan Carroll and Dan Chaon to celebrate the release of Mr. Breakfast. A little bit about our authors today. Jonathan Carroll is the author of 20 novels, including the critically acclaimed The Wooden Sea, The Land of Laughs, and Outside the Dog Museum, for which he won a British Fantasy Award for Best Novel of the Year. He is the winner of a Pushcart Prize, 2 French Fantasy Awards, a Bram Stoker Award, and a World Fantasy Award. Dan Chaon is an American educator and award-winning writer, the author of the national bestseller Ill Will, which was recognized as one of the top 10 books of 2017 by a number of publications, including the New York Times, Publishers Weekly, and Los Angeles Times. Thank you both so much for being here today.
Thank you.
All right, so I will be heading out in just a little bit and let you guys talk. But for anybody who is new to Crowdcast, I'd want to just give a quick rundown of how it all works. To the right-hand side is the chat section. So you want to make sure to use this to chat amongst yourselves, put fun comments in, and that sort of thing. But if you have any questions for our authors, make sure that you drop it in the Ask a Question box below. That's where, after about 30 or 40 minutes, we'll do a Q&A from the audience, and that's where we will look for those questions. So make sure to drop them there. Finally, make sure to check out the little blue button here that says Buy Mr. Breakfast and get a signed book plate. That's going to take you to our webpage where you can buy this book, and it will include a signed book plate. So without further ado, I'll give a little intro about Mr. Breakfast, which sounds so good. It is about a failed comedian whose life is sort of blowing up. The love of his life recently broke up with him. He has no idea what to do. So with nothing to lose, he buys a new car to drive across country, ends up getting a tattoo. And these events lead to him having the ability to see in real time 3 different lives that are available to him. So it sounds fascinating. I'm going to go ahead and disappear. But thank you both so much for being here, and just go ahead and take it away.
All right. So, we're going to be talking about astral traveling today a little bit. And I just want to mention a little astral traveling of my own, which is that I read The Land of Laughs when I was in high school, and it made a huge impression on me. And so I just want to say sort of hello to that 16-year-old wherever he is, and say, look what happened. You got to meet him.
For better or worse.
Yeah. But I also wanted to ask, I think about the things, the writers that influence us as a kind of lineage. And that we are in some ways in conversation with those writers that made a difference to us, but we're also in some ways they're children, or their nephews and nieces. And who were the writers that you think of as your progenitors, the ones that made a difference to you when you were a young person?
Well, I didn't start reading seriously until I was about 16 or 17. And then I became voracious. But I think that the number one when I was around 16 was Thomas Wolfe. Not Tom Wolfe, Thomas Wolfe.
Right.
Just reading, about a kid growing up in North Carolina at the turn of the century, basically, was so different yet so relatable to my own life that it was kind of a wow moment for me, because it was like, this kid is me, but he's not me. And suddenly, wheels started to click in my head. And, I wanted to read more of this guy. And before then, I had no interest in any writer.
Yeah. There's something about Wolfe, about the prose that just, I think, kind of sings, especially when you're that age, because it's so open-hearted and full of big emotion.
It's like a big Italian sandwich, you almost can't put your mouth around it. I'll tell you a story. When I was 11 or 12, I was madly in love with a girl named Wendy Nelson. and I wanted to take her out on a date. So my older brother said to me, "I'll give you $1 if you read this book of Mice and Men, and then I'm going to give you a little pop quiz to see if you really did it." And so I said, okay. So I read the book. I brought it back to my brother. He gave me the pop quiz. I passed. He said, "Well, did you like it?" I said, "Oh, yeah, I loved it." He said, "You want to read another one?" I said, "No." That was my reading experience until my late teens, when just suddenly everything shifted, and I read Look Homeward Angel,
Right.
and that was a changer.
You were quite a young man when Land of Laughs came out. I think still in your middle 20s, maybe
Late 20s, yeah.
late 20s, yeah.
And
And you were in Vienna by that point.
Yeah, I had written several novels before that no one wanted, and I was the three before that were realistic, and the thing with Land of Laughs was I reached a point where the dogs talk, and that was a changing moment for me, because what happened, I can remember it very vividly. I wrote it without even thinking about it. Boom, 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 the dogs talk. And I stopped and went, whoa, okay, what's next? Rather than saying, I can't do this, is ridiculous, I went with it. And, that's been my blessing and curse throughout my career, because people will say, oh, I love the realism and I hated the kids flying.
Right.
That was a no-no, or the dogs talking. And I'm looking at you right now, and I'm seeing one of your dogs over your shoulder staring at me very grimly, and I'm maybe he's hearing what I'm saying.
That's Shirley Jackson. So she's probably disturbed by her.
How dare you?
Yes. Yeah. So I wanted to ask, before we get into talking about Mr. Breakfast, I wanted to ask a little bit about being an expat. Is that how you think of yourself, as an expat? I don't know whether that's the right
funny
term.
Because everybody kind of alludes to the fact that expats are dissatisfied with their country, and I don't have that feeling at all. I think that home is where you're most comfortable, and I've been comfortable in Vienna for many years. I went to America in the middle '90s to write movies for 2 years.
Right.
And I had a really good time. I made some money and I met some interesting people and stuff. But I just one moment of epiphany. I said I'd rather be back in Vienna writing novels rather than screenplays.
Yeah, I had sort of a similar experience. Just
out of the country,
you lose work. I mean, I wrote a TV series and they still own it, but they're not going to make it. So that's gone. Whereas, if you write a novel, even if nobody publishes you still have it.
My story about that is, remember the film The Flintstones?
Uh-huh.
With John Goodman and Rick Moranis.
I just remember Elizabeth Taylor was in it.
I don't remember the rest of the cast, but here's the thing: if you ever see a poster for the Flintstones, look to see who wrote it. There are 11 writers credited.
Right.
It's a goofy comedy, and I don't know if it was successful or not, but those 11 guys were paid a lot of money, and I don't know if I want that carved on my gravestone. Oh yes, he wrote the Flintstones. I'd rather have one of the things that I wrote.
Right. One thing that I thought was interesting. I mean, Mr. Breakfast first appeared in a Polish edition in 2019. Is that right?
Polish, and then followed by the Italians. Yeah.
Followed by the Italian, and then you had that a similar thing earlier in your career with your short story collection, The Panican, which first appeared in German.
Right.
And is that how did that come about? I mean, are you involved very, very deeply in your translations? I'm assuming you speak German and Polish and.
No, not at all. I mean, as you know, when you write a book, what happens is it not only does your U.S. or U.K. agent send it out to
Right.
US and UK publishers. They send it out to the Italians and so and so. And in the case of Poland, Poland has always been an incredibly strong supporter of what I do. And it got to the point where they would be publishing for about the last 7 or 8 novels. They would publish them first before anybody else. And I was happy with that because they're an incredibly supportive bunch of readers, curious about everything.
That's really interesting. Let's kind of talk about Mr. Breakfast now for a while. I was wondering about your. I mean, this is a book that's kind of exciting because it brings back Crane's View. Marshall France gets a little mention in it, which is nice to see. And it's a book that I'm hesitant to describe the plot too fully because I think I think like all your books, there's some surprises that are nice to keep hidden. But it's a book about multiple lives or the possibility of multiple lives. In some ways, it's got elements of A Christmas Carol in that, you know, he through magical means, he's allowed to see the different possibilities that could happen and to choose one. It's also in some ways like It's a Wonderful Life, in that he also gets to see what might have happened to people that he influenced. There's this really great passage. I think it's towards the end, but in life we pass through so many doors and close them behind us. Sometimes with an angry slam, sometimes just a gentle click, moving on. We rarely think about most of the people we left behind and what they did or how they lived after we left, but they do carry on too. And I mean, there's an element to this book that seems like it's in some ways a reflection of the choices that we make as an artist, and the ways in which those almost always necessarily mean that we're leaving the people that we love for long periods of time to live in an imaginary world. And in you know, the choices that that your main character has here often have to do with, you know, the choice between love and art. And I wonder if you feel that is a choice that is, you know, that has to be made by an artist, that you can't really have both.
I think, you know, as one of my friends once said, look at the greatest artists, writers, composers, painters who've ever lived. How many of them had normal lives?
Yeah.
And you know, it's sort of basic, but I mean, most writers or artists in general are pretty solitary people. They have to be, because that's where they're doing their, you know, their everyday. And so, you know, first of all, what partner wants to put up with, you know, those empty spaces or shenanigans? And with you as the center point, you have to decide how much of your life you're going to give to your work or to your daily life. And it's not an easy decision to make.
Yeah, I remember, I guess it was after you had finished publishing the sextet, there were a lot of rumors in it that you had decided to quit writing. Do you remember this, or did you know about this?
Never heard of it.
That's crazy.
Tell me. I'm all ears.
Well, I mean, this was before. I think it was before Beehive came out, and then maybe there was a gap between the two books or something.
I think so. Yeah.
And I had heard, like, and I don't know where the rumor started. I think I'd heard it from a bookstore owner who told me, "Oh, I think he stopped writing."
I love it.
Yeah,
maybe I should have.
And so
There you
then,
go. It's like Mr. Breakfast.
the new
I should have stopped
Crane's
writing
View
and
book came
become
out.
a piano player in a bar.
Right. Well, but when the Crane's View books came out, it was suddenly it was kind of a different you, right?
Yeah.
Those books, like, we felt like, oh, here's a new Jonathan Carroll.
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe like in part this book, the Mr. Breakfast, is about those transformations that we go through, and the choices that we make, obviously, but also, I mean, you've said in the past, like, I guess in Ghost in Love, you talk about all of us having multiple selves, that we're like, we're not just one personality over time, but we're this sort of Tower of Babel of various selves.
Exactly.
But in this book, there's also this sort of longing for a concept of a core self. I mean, I think in the early part, the narrator says, I've never been able to get to my core. I've never been able to see or feel or create from the middle of my soul. And so there's those two things sort of pulling against each other, that idea, or I think it's more of a wish that there's a core. And the actual fact is that, the 16-year-old me is probably locked in a basement somewhere, in the back of my head. And I'm not letting him out either.
Well, I think that in a way that's true, but in another way, the 16-year-old self is very vocal and sometimes correct, sometimes right. For example, I've written about this in someplace else, in which the 16-year-old has a bravery I no longer have. The 24-year-old will write a book. If it sounds ridiculous, but if I were to start writing now, I don't think I'd write Land of Laughs. It's too chancy. It's a weird kind of mixed salad of a story. It's realistic, but it's also weird, and it's got talking dogs and all this stuff. And as an older person, I don't know if I would have the quote courage to write something off that way off. So I when I say that I think I called it a United Nations of me. There's
that's right.
20-year-old me, 17-year-old me, 6-year-old me, and older, and they're always arguing with each other.
Yeah, and one of the things I love about this novel and the plot of this novel is the way in which all of those different he gets to sort of touch all of those different selves, as well as sort of to see the various futures that those selves might have created. It's like there's a maybe there's a core, but moving out from that is a kind of Mandelbrot of different threads and webs that themselves are ever expanding. And that's a really interesting idea. I ended up feeling by the end of the novel that I was convinced that I wouldn't take the choice that the tattoo offered me. I would stick with what I got. But that might be just because I'm not a gambler. How about you?
Well, that's the point that I was making, which is maybe 24-year-old you would have said, well, I'd like to go become a piano player in a bar someplace, or whatever your other fantasy is. And I think that really does play a part in a lot of the major and minor decisions we make in life. Would I choose another life? I did. I left teaching and I left Vienna, and I went to California for 2 years and went through that whole experience. I learned what that life was about. And then came the Northridge earthquake, which was a kind of a wake-up call.
Right.
And after that, I said, is this really what I want to do? Is this where I want to be at this point in my life? And it was a very basic decision. Now it's more comfortable for me back in Vienna. So I returned. So I was lucky in that sense. I got to shift and have another life for 700 days. And then I came back.
Yeah, I think everybody should probably have that experience.
Well, the only thing that holds me back is you remember the story, The Garden of Forking Paths by Borges?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Well, that kind of has spooked me all my life, which is a guy chooses a path, but thinking that it goes from A to B. But what happens is that as soon as he gets to B, the path forks with unexpected things, like his wife dies or his
Right.
he makes a fortune or whatever it is, and he goes from life A to life B totally unprepared because he thought that life B would be, pretty women and lots of money. And he says it is pretty women and lots of money, but you have a lot of taxes, and the women are maybe not going to be your dreamboats, and the paths fork. And I think that no matter what you choose in life, whatever destination you choose, comes with some pitfalls.
Right. And also, I mean, I don't think I'm giving anything away by saying that when a choice is finally made in the novel, it's somewhat spur of the moment and impetuous. And I feel like that's so true to the way that we end up often making choices in our lives. Even the most major choices are not necessarily done with a chart and pros and cons listed on either side of a page. They're just like a spur of the moment, and those are the things we have to live with.
Exactly, and it may be enormous. You know what I mean? I'm definitely going to do this, and then snap, something happens, and snap, I do that. And sometimes it works out. Sometimes it's for the better, and sometimes it's not. We want control of our lives, but the joke is what's that old line? When people make plans, the devil smiles.
Right.
It's that kind of thing.
Yeah. Well, there's so many lovely moments in this book, and moments that not only are sort of fresh views of the world of this that we're living in, but also things that echo back through your other books. I'm always glad to see a dog show up, and there are several really wonderful dogs that appear here. We get to, as I said before, we get to revisit Crane's View again, and there's some amazing scenes and just kind of iconic American places like diners and small towns. And since you've been away, I mean, I guess you said you were in LA for a couple of years, but where does your America come from?
I have great fondness for America. I haven't been back in a while, but that's just because I'm lazy. But
your imagination is. I mean, how much of it is drawing on your memory of and how much is it, sort of your invention?
Probably mostly memory. I remember, you mentioned, the diners and the truck stops and the center of town in nowhere, Utah.
Right.
I remember driving across country and just being delighted by nothing. The truck stop and the guy selling tomatoes by the side of the road, stuff like that, and being away from it for so many years was nice to go back to it like a visitor, but with very strong memories of I used to be here, and it's really not so different. There are bigger buildings or better cars, but I remember driving down Main Street, and when I grew up in a small town, which is what Crane's View is based on, and a lot of that has stuck with me for many years.
Right. And I love that, because of the kaleidoscopic nature of this novel, we get to see multiple views and visions of these places. The Mr. Breakfast Diner first appears to us in a photograph as a boarded up shell of itself, but later in the book we get to go there when it is alive and present in the world. And it's such a, I mean, the contrast is so beautiful. And I mean, I think as with all your books, there's a real strain of melancholy that runs through, but it's not a despairing melancholy either. I mean, I feel like that's something that all your novels seem to avoid is despair.
I'm glad that you use melancholy, because that is not necessarily a bad thing. You know what I mean?
No,
melancholy heightens whatever it is that you're thinking about. It may have sadness in it, but it also, the colors. It's a little bit like the Wizard of Oz when Dorothy steps out of the house and everything's in color. Some of the colors are too bright, and others are distorted. But it makes the whole world a much more, I think, interesting place. If everything is happiness, that's too thin. Melancholy is like cayenne pepper. A little pinch of cayenne on food adds a whole new dimension, and I think that's what melancholy does.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think one of the wonderful tricks that you have in this book, I mean, I call it a trick, but it's just because I'm always watching to see what other people do. But one of the wonderful things is in one of his lives, the narrator is a world famous photographer, and his photographs are all very ordinary things. So in the midst of this, of all this sort of magical and supernatural stuff, one of the most magical things are these photographs of ordinary objects. And I love that contrast, because the magic itself is treated as sort of the most ordinary thing in the world. And it's these sort of glowing moments of daily life that have the most magic to them.
I think that we can relate to. I mean, I thought hard about the photographs in the book, and one of them actually happened to me. The one about the woman and the dog woman eating the ice cream, and the dog in the background.
Oh, then the dog glaring at her.
Yeah. That really happened. But the others that are mentioned, I just kind of put things that stuck in my mind together. Like I always loved driving in the West in strange, Utah and Nevada, way out in the back parts, and you'd see the equivalent of Mr. Breakfast abandoned diners or gas stations or restaurants and this and that. And there was so much life there at one point, and now it's just it's beyond sad, because there was a life, and it's unfortunately not part of its existence anymore. It's just bones of life. Right.
Yeah, there's something about ruins that really inspire me, and that may be because ruins in the U.S. are not as common in some ways, and they're younger.
Yeah.
The town where I grew up in Nebraska no longer exists, because it just was one of those little teeny grain elevator towns, and everybody left, and it's completely been mowed over. And that didn't even. I mean, the town didn't even last 100 years. Which is, I guess, which is a very different experience than say living in Vienna, which has lasted more.
The town that I grew up in was, an hour and a half from New York City, and it had its own kind of smallness. There was the two restaurants were a dumpy pizza parlor and a dumpy steakhouse, and I don't know what what it was like for you in a small town, but because you're limited to certain things. There's only one place that you can play
Right,
baseball. There's
right.
only one movie theater which changes its movie like once a month. I mean, this is universal. You know, I'm sure that versions of it happen in the outbacks of Austria as well. So that I think that if we do it well as writers, no matter where these visions are taking place, and even at what times, people can say, "Yeah, I know that."
Right, right. That Ozymandias moment.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
Yeah. So we've got about we've got about 7 questions now, and I'm gonna read these and see whether there's anything good in here. I have more questions as well, but I want to give other people a chance to ask. Given how invested you must get with characters who appear over more than one book, how do you know when you're done with them? And are you ever tempted to revisit them?
Well, some of them I kill on
Yeah.
purpose.
What's Harry Radcliffe doing these days? This Dave wants to know.
I was thinking Harry Radcliffe is the main character of my book Outside the Dog Museum, and he's a brilliant architect who's also a little bit nuts. And after I wrote Outside the Dog Museum, I wrote a short story about Harry Radcliffe, and he's in Vienna riding a horse. And it was funny because the story came about exactly like that question. What's Harry Radcliffe doing? Well, let's put him in Vienna and have him riding a horse, which is completely un-Harry-like if you knew him from the previous book. So you know you're done with a character basically, and I'm sure you feel this too, when they've had their say. You know, there's nothing more to add to it. For example,
yeah, I tend to kill people off pretty brutally, so I don't have to worry about them anymore.
Well, no, that's one way of looking at it. I mean, I wrote the 2 books, White Apples and Glass Soup, which was planned as a trilogy. The first book was about the woman, the second book was about the man, and then there was the third book was going to be about their child. And I have been scolded for years saying, "Where's this third book?" You know, by people who read. I don't know. I have never been able to find what this kid is up to. And you know, I don't want to cheat myself or my readers by
Right.
just kind of coming up with something.
Right.
So that's kind of the reverse of that question. It's like, how do I introduce this character into the world? If I can't find a place, they stay in the ethers.
Yeah. Well, it's not over yet. I mean, he may still show up. Okay. Bev Vincent asks, do you ever go back to those unpublished early novels and wonder whether, 1, how different your career might have been if they'd been your first books, and 2, you would ever consider publishing them now?
I was asked to publish them some years ago, and I said no. They were like, you know, riding a bicycle with training wheels on them.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some good stuff in them, but I don't. I always use this image. I don't want them carved on my gravestone. The books that have been published, any of them can be carved on my grave. You know, he wrote Mr. Breakfast, or he wrote The Land of Laughs. But those unpublished ones, no, they're just not formed. They're kind of like silly putty. What was the other part of the question?
How different your career might have been if they'd been your first books?
That's a good question. That's a really good question.
I mean, that's
as I said, my early books were very realistic. Then I don't. You know the writer Harry Crews?
Sure.
Okay, I read this book by Harry Crews called The Gospel Singer, and it changed a lot for me because he was so crazy and over the top, realistic but not really. And I started reading a lot of Crews, like Car, where a man eats a car, and other things by him. And I thought, oh boy, you can go broader than what you've been doing. And that for me was the change. Which, if I'd stayed on the original stuff, it would have just been realistic forever, for better or worse.
Right. let's see. Your writing is very. This is from Jeff. Your writing is very quotable, and you seem to really like quotations from other writers. Can you talk about your love of quotes and their influence on your writing?
Mr. Chaon is one person that I've posted quotes from more than once.
Oh, is that right?
Take a bow.
All right.
I think that any writer who's honest and worth his salt wants to see what others are up to.
Mm-hmm.
It starts there. I used to tell when I was teaching, I used to tell my creative writers, before you start writing, read like crazy. Because if nothing else, you may find that somebody has already written what you were planning on writing, and what you would be doing is a waste of time. Not because the guy's better than you, but because you're just starting out, and that he wrote Catcher in the Rye some way down the road, so that he was an adult, and he had a mature vision of how a young person should live or see the world. And once you've read enough, which can be quite a bit, then you can sit down and say, well, how do I want to say it, and in what way?
Right. Okay. This is a more personal question. We miss you here in the U.S. This says Jason. Any plans in the immediate or far horizon for a U.S. tour?
No, and
no.
I've talked to other writers, and they say that, I mean, they're writers really well known, and their publishers are not they're not behind doing a book tour for a number of reasons. Right. And I think that from what I can see, in most cases, book tours, which used to be I used to do lots of book tours, now it's a financial thing for them. And so that, they may be enthusiastic about your book, but do they want to spend X $1,000s to bring you over and put you up in hotels and travel you around America?
Right.
That's the biz.
Yeah, well, COVID has really changed things. I did do a small tour this summer, and the people weren't coming out in the way that they used to.
Understandably, with COVID.
Yeah, of course.
I see that everybody was doing these kind of things that we're doing right now, and saying, well, it kind of misses the human element. And I go, well, if you go and you perform, quote, in front of 100 to 200 people, the chances are one of them has COVID, and that could be dangerous. And if you're going from city to city with a good following, it plays into your thinking.
Yeah, for sure. What do you find the most challenging part of the writing process? Asked Kels.
I think I've said this so often before. I think there are two kinds of writers. There are those who know exactly what they want to do from A to Z.
Yeah.
And I know that, for example, John Irving always writes the end of a book before anything else, literally the last pages, and then he goes back to the beginning with a through line, knowing what he wants to do to get to that conclusion. And then there are others, which I always call it walking the big dog, which is you open the door and the dog flies out in one direction and you can barely control it, so you're kind of following behind it. And I'm one of those writers.
Me too.
I can start a book if I know the first line or the title, and then I can go. And literally, that's what's been happening for years for me. And it's not an exaggeration. First line or the title.
Right. I'm writing a book right now for the first time in my life that I don't know the title, which is a little scary. But I don't know anything about it, actually. So.
Yeah, but sometimes that happens, and you it's almost like those things that the police put across the road when they want to stop a car. Those spiky things. I forget what they're called. It'll make the tires flat on the car. I think that it's like that sometimes with writing. You're driving really fast down the road, and then you drive over these puncture things, and it not only slows you down, but it changes everything, and sometimes for the good and sometimes for the bad. I know that this has happened to me several times with books. I mean, when I was writing The Marriage of Sticks, everything was going perfectly. I had the famous editor and a good publisher, and I wrote half the book at speed, and then absolutely stopped. And that's when I went to California. I said, I can't solve this now. I don't know what happens. And so I left it for 2 years, and actually, I think that helped.
Yeah. This is, you've kind of answered this question, but I'm just gonna run it by you. This is from Laura. As much as I love to read, I thought of writing a novel is daunting. What is your process for writing? I mean, that's a huge question. Is there something like always use a number 2 pencil, or is there one of those like wise things that people can write down?
It's a trick question. I know a
It
writer.
is.
I know a writer who told me a funny story. He said, on my 10th book tour or whatever, I realized that at least one person would ask me the same question everywhere, which is, what do you use to write? This is actually before the time of computers. And he said, I use this and this and this. And then it suddenly came to me. What these people were asking was, if I buy the right pen and the right paper and the right ink, I can do what you do.
Right.
I can do that magic because you found the perfect combination, and innocently, it ain't that way. It's basically you bring an enthusiasm. I have a story to tell. I have a character that I really want to develop because I think that they're valid. I remember when I wrote my book Bones of the Moon, I came up with the first line, which is, the axe boy lived downstairs. And I went, holy shit, that's a great line. Who is it? Where is that? Where are they? Who says this? Who's the axe boy? All this stuff. And I was revved up just because of the fact that this thing came to me, and I said, I got to develop it.
I mean, and that's all you really need for the process, right? Is
enthusiasm.
Yeah, and something to chase.
I think that
you're chasing that axe boy, right? You want to know what he's going to do. Okay, here's. Oh yeah, go ahead.
No.
I was gonna switch topics on this other question, but I'd rather hear what you had to say.
I actually don't remember, so please do.
Forgot. I'm sorry. This is from Greg. Why such a long delay between the original Polish publication and the English release?
Of Mr. Breakfast?
Of Mr. Breakfast, yeah.
COVID, changing of agents. Some publishers didn't like the book, it's kind of the normal process.
Right.
The Poles and the Italians read it and immediately wanted it, and they brought it out so fast that usually, particularly in America, usually, I don't know if this happens with you, Dan, but my experience has been it's at least a year.
Oh yeah.
From when you hand it in to when it's in the reader's hands. The Polish, for example, they had, as I remember it, they had a full translation and the book in stores 4 months after I gave them the manuscript. 4 months. That's
right.
That's fast.
Yeah. Yeah, I had I have the same with my Italian publisher. They're really, really quick.
Yeah, I think that it depends both on the country and the enthusiasm of whatever house you have, and fate. Right.
Well, I think this is one of your best books, and I'm hoping that it will be widely embraced across America. Because
an evil friend of mine said, I'll kill them in the next life. An evil friend of mine said, hey, I just looked at your page on Amazon, and somebody said the book is really good because it's wacky.
It's wacky.
Thank God. I'm finally in the category of wacky. It says a lot.
Right. Well, I mean, I wouldn't use that word to describe this book, but it does bring together all the different elements that I've loved in your other books, and in some ways feels like it's it's got a greatest hits quality to it, in that it really brings out so many of the things that I've previously been excited about. Here's another question: Are there any upcoming books or projects you are working on? And that's from the bookstore. The bookstore wants to know.
Well, I have a new short story in Tor.com website coming up in March, and I'm slowly getting. I've got the beginning to a novel, and it's beginning to rev me up. But for a while, it was just after I finished Mr. Breakfast, I was just kind of depleted. But this idea came relatively recently, and I said, "Hey, I think I can do something with that." So let's hope it takes.
How far do you have to get before you feel like it's like a book is alive? I feel like 50 pages, maybe.
How long for you?
50 pages.
Yeah, that's a good number. I think that you kind of give up part of yourself when a book takes off for you. You know, you become more like the characters than yourself, at least for the time that you're writing. And that's
and you're living in that world for probably a year at least, and everything in your real life is getting sucked into the novel.
Yep. Yeah, and I think that's when you know it's going to work or it's not. And in fact, as I told you before, when I was stuck with The Marriage of Sticks, I thought this is going to be the first dead book I ever tried to write.
Mm-hmm.
I just don't know where to go with it. And luckily, kind of, I had the option to go out to California because someone had hired me to write the screenplay of one of my novels. So I was, okay, let's go. And then when I was out there, I kept getting jobs, and I thought, I'll stay for a while.
Right. Which novel was it?
The screenplay?
Yeah.
After Silence.
Okay. And
which is one of the realistic.
In progress?
No.
Is it still no? Yeah.
It never. A friend of mine out in California once said something to me. He said, "Do you know how many projects are living at all times in Hollywood?" I said, "I don't know, a couple of hundred." He said, "Usually close to 1,000, and that includes Meryl Streep movies and porn, but a lot." And he said, "How many films are nominated for best actor, best of anything for the Oscars?" And I said, "I don't know, 5." And he said, "So you have 5 great possibilities and 995 too worse." And he said, the chances of things happening for you, even if you're a touted writer or actor or whatever, are not that good. It's kind of like the end of the rainbow.
Yeah. Okay, here's a question from Alan. Are there any books you've read during your life that you would have given anything to have written yourself?
Light Years by James Salter.
Oh, nice. Yeah.
Anything by Salter is an amazing piece of work, and I think that he's one of the great masters of our time.
Oh God, yeah. I mean, there's a little tiny story of his called Acnilo. Do you know that story?
I know, I read it, but 100 years ago.
Yeah, it still blows me away. It still is so haunting.
I was lucky enough many years ago to spend a few days with Salter here in Vienna. He was on tour for something, and I kept looking at him and saying, "You went to West Point. You were a jet fighter pilot. You wrote films with Irwin Shaw." I mean, I just thought, and then he died a couple of years ago at like 90. I thought, if anyone had a life to the max, it was Salter, and a couple of masterpieces.
Yeah, for sure. What are you currently reading? Asks Kels.
Someone told me about this novelist by a South American woman named Mariana Enrique.
Oh
It's
yeah.
called Our Share of Night, and it's a huge lump of paper. It's like 700 pages long, but so far it's pretty good. I mean, I don't know if I'd be over the rainbow for it, but it's held me for half so far.
Yeah. I've been
Have you
reading.
read it?
I have not. I've been reading a lot of Jonathan Carroll in the last few weeks. Yeah, I got to go back to some old favorites, check out some ones that I hadn't read. So that was really fun. And then the other book I've been reading is The Circus of Dr. Lao by Charles Finney.
That Finney wrote the famous book.
No, it's a different Finney. This guy was a newspaper man. He didn't really write much after this. And my new book has a circus in it, so I was like trolling for details, but it's pretty weird little book. It feels like it had some influence on Bradbury and maybe even on Calvino. But nobody, it's not something that most people talk about these days.
Isn't it interesting when you hear that a really famous, kind of god of writing was really influenced by something completely obscure and in some cases like trash, something
right.
that kind of a crime writer you've never heard of who wrote in the 30s and died penniless under a bridge. That novel so influenced Calvino or somebody like that. It's fascinating to me.
Right. Well, I mean, I think books and all kinds of art speak to us in different ways, and I think the best you can hope for is that you get this opportunity to speak to one soul in that kind of intimate way. I mean, I would choose that over a bestseller any day.
Well, bestsellers they're in a category by themselves, and I think that it's not fair to them or to people who are going in a different direction to compare the two. If you look at the New York Times bestseller list, a lot of times it's the same people again and again and again and again and again, because obviously there's a huge market out there for them. Mm-hmm. Whereas for the middle what do you call it, mid-list author, it's got an entirely different audience, which is it's like apples and oranges, and people are always either saying, John le Carré is not a serious novelist. Well, to some people he is, and to some pretty influential people. And so I get kind of my feathers get ruffled when people say things like the Le Carré. It's like it's just a different thing, and you can't mix the two.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I'm pretty omnivorous when it comes to genre, and I'm not necessarily that interested in what is considered literary right now or not, because it seems like that changes. I mean, especially we've gone through a period where at one point at least writing what stuff that has elements of fantasy or elements of genre was like the kiss of death in terms of getting into the high literary art club, which I never really wanted to do anyway. But
the pantheon, right. But then again, the people who are in the pantheon sell 3 books sometimes.
Yeah.
Some of these guys. I was just reading about this man William Gaddis, who wrote this famous book called The Recognitions, which I found unreadable. But I mean, some people hold on to it with 2 hands and saying, this is seriously a great novel. And I go, fine. It didn't strike me, but I know that it didn't sell well, although it established a very firm place in the pantheon for Gaddis, and he wrote it until the end of his life. Right.
Well, we're getting close to 4 o'clock, but I one of the things I noticed on Wikipedia is that your birthday is next week.
It is.
So
I'll be 25.
That's a good. I mean, it's an auspicious time to publish a new book, and I want to wish you a happy birthday and many more.
Thank you very much, Dan. And again, thank you for doing this. It means a lot to me, both
It's
as
my
a favor
pleasure.
and also because I like what you do a lot.
Thanks.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you both so much for being here today. It was an absolute pleasure to hear you both talk about the nature of storytelling and the whole writing process and just books in general. To everybody who joined here today, thank you again so much for being here, for sending in those questions. Don't forget to purchase your copy of Mr. Breakfast through Mysterious Galaxy. Just click that little link below and you'll get the signed book plate. All right.
Dan's
Well, it's
books.
yes, all of Dan's books. Dan, are you working on something? Do you have a book?
I
that you can talk about?
I had a novel that came out this year called Sleepwalk,
Yes.
and that will be in paperback in May, I believe. So
Awesome. And yeah, and everybody who's listening, you can pre-order that as well. Even if the book is not out yet, you can go ahead and click that. You can click the button, and that'll take you to the virtual event page, and you can find Dan's books there. So you can always don't forget to pre-order. All right,
really
thank you.
helps.
It does. It always helps.
Yep.
Thank you all so much for coming again. Have a great rest of the day for you. It's only 1 o'clock here, so we have a whole day ahead of us.
I have to feed my dogs because it's 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock here, and they're demanding.
Say hello to Shirley
That's
Jackson for me.
I will.
Thanks again, both of you.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
So long.